You're listening to the Unwritable Rant podcast with your host and bourbon-soaked storyteller, Juliette Miranda.
Hey there, y'all. Welcome to episode 112 of the Unwritable Rant podcast. I'm Juliette Miranda, and today I have two bourbon-soaked stories for you about a house of winged horrors and personal cesspools. But before we get to the storytelling, we need to do some bourbon drinking. So join me, y'all. Cheers. Oh, that is one hell of a fine bourbon. Today, I am drinking Rabbit Hole Sherry Cask Bourbon. Y'all, you have no idea how excited I was when I found out that this is a wheated bourbon, which is probably my favorite flavor profile. The mash bill is 68% corn, 18% wheat, and 14% malted barley. It's been aged 5 years before being transferred to sherry casks for an additional 6 months of aging. Y'all, between the wheat and the corn and the sherry, this bourbon is crazy smooth and just bursting with warm, fruity flavors like raisin and cherry. It kind of reminds me of trail mix, and I know that sounds crazy, but hear me out on this. With all those fruity flavors and everything from the wheat and the corn, the malted barley just gives it a little bit of earthy balance. It's almost a little grassy, and then it's got that almond creaminess to it. Oh, it's so easy to drink. Now, me personally, I would like just a touch more spice to it. Either that or maybe a little bit more oak. But I think the one thing that would really just enhance all of the flavors of this bourbon is a really good cigar. Either way, y'all, this is killer. I'm totally enjoying it. I've got mine straight up, but I wouldn't judge you if you added just a little bit of ice to it. It's actually quite the nice autumn bourbon. And it being autumn, y'all, and Halloween right around the corner, well, that makes me wonder, what scares you? But really, beyond that, do you know why you're afraid of something? Because these past couple of episodes, I've talked about clowns and Ouija boards and musicians, which are all scary in their own right. But I often wonder just what it is that causes us to be afraid of something. I have a few very specific fears, but none is more pronounced than my fear of insects. Anything with more than 4 legs or wings will send me screaming from the room, and I have zero shame in admitting it. Of course, I also know what prompted this terror, and it is anything but irrational. As a kid, I was naturally curious and far more outdoorsy than I am now. I would dig in the dirt, collect caterpillars in coffee tins, and I had no trouble threading a worm on a fishing hook. I wasn't especially enthusiastic about spiders, but few people are. So long as they stuck to their designated corners and bushes, we got along just fine. And really, the Midwest, and especially its suburban portions, well, they're not exactly known as a haven for multi-legged creatures. At least not like Texas, where the insects are so horrifyingly huge they can wrestle pit bulls to the ground. So really, I spent much of my kiddom blissfully unaware of and coexisting with the insect world. Until one Sunday morning in October. I think I was about 9 years old then, and on that day, I was the first one up. The house was chilly and still dark as I tiptoed my way to the bathroom. It was unusual that I would have the whole bathroom to myself. Most mornings I had to dodge my mom wrangling my sister into some semblance of order. But on that day, it was just me. At least, as far as I knew. I washed my face and went about my usual routine, brushing my teeth last and looking forward to the day and going out with my dad to grab donuts and doing general Sunday stuff. So just like any other day, I spit out my toothpaste, filled my plastic cup with water, and took a large swig to rinse my mouth. Mentally, I'm thinking about chocolate frosting and hoping for Halloween sprinkles, and not really paying too much attention to what I'm doing, until I notice an exceptionally odd sensation in my mouth. I swished the contents around a little bit. It wasn't a tooth that had fallen out. That would have felt more like a pebble. And what's more, I didn't have any loose teeth. This felt more like hair. A weird, writhing mass of hair. I go to spit that strange water mixture out into the sink, and the second I open my mouth, a gigantic Midwest house centipede attempts to scurry out with all of the water. These things are occasionally referred to as thousand-leggers, and these vile little fuckers are known for what are actually 15 pairs of extremely long, jointed legs. They're soft and wispy and disturbingly fast, as I quickly learned when several of that centipede's legs got caught up in my bottom teeth. It was long enough to dangle down my chin, which it latched onto with approximately 20 of its remaining legs. They were all moving at once to propel the centipede from my face, down my neck, and ultimately onto the bathroom counter where I knocked it in a fit of horrified flailing. I hadn't realized it, but that whole time, I'm screaming. I am sure they were the most primal screams a child has ever let loose. And they were enough to cause both of my parents to come tearing into the bedroom to see who was murdering their firstborn. My mom was armed with a baseball bat, and my dad had his handgun, which, had this happened today, I likely would have grabbed and used to blow several holes into the bathroom counter just to ensure that multi-legged asshole and his friends knew who was in charge. My dad, of course, was a very reasonable and mostly sane gun owner. So once he ascertained that I was okay, he quickly ran to lock that gun back up, leaving my mother to deal with me. That centipede lay in a twitching mass on the countertop, near death, but I'm sure still alert enough to be signaling for its family for backup. Now me, I was inconsolable. And it didn't help that once my dad was appraised of what had happened, he started poking at that vile creature and calling out things like, "Wow, I've never seen a centipede so big." Needless to say, to this day, I have harbored a gripping, mind-melding horror. Not just of centipedes, but all insects, who by default are just as appalling. Here's the thing. Every so often, I get it into my head that maybe I should try to get over my fears, especially the ones that I know in my more rational moments will never actually cause me harm. Now, there is no way in flaming hell that you will get me in a room with a centipede. Fuck that. And spiders are out too. So I thought that maybe I could start weaning my fears away with something considerably less intimidating. Something smaller and maybe pretty, even. And that, y'all, would be a butterfly. Oh yes, even butterflies give me the creeps. Mostly because I hate the way their wings flap around so unpredictably. And the thought of having one of those winged freaks caught up in my hair, y'all, that is exactly what has kept me out of the butterfly house at our local zoo for years. But all that was gonna change. I announced this to my guy a few weeks ago. It was the last genuinely hot day of the year, and we'd gone to the zoo to honor the passing of summer by getting what we like to call zoo drunk. Well, I had had just enough Safari Surf Mai Tais to make visiting the butterfly house seem like a brilliant and brave idea. And my guy had had just enough booze to not feel like talking sense into me. This is why we make such a good couple. So we walk up to the butterfly house and find that it is set up like a tented park of sorts. So it's designed to act like a greenhouse. There are several winding paths and tons of low bushes and plants to mimic the natural environments of 6 or 7 species of butterflies. My heart is pounding as we walk into the exhibit. Now, I am initially relieved to see that the inside does not resemble a reenactment of the birds starring butterflies. There are no hovering black clouds of butterflies. They're not hanging from the ceiling like bats. What random butterflies I could see were really just hanging out around knee level. All right, well, that I could deal with. So my plan was just to follow the main path through the exhibit and right out the back door. Because, it looked all quiet and nice in there, but I did not trust those buggers no matter how pretty they looked. Oh, but then there's my guy. My loving, handsome guy who every so often likes to side with the devil and poke my crazy. He insists that to really take steps toward conquering my fear, I should at least look at a live butterfly. So I stare at him blankly and I just say, "When did you start hating me?" Well, he laughs. I mean, it's more like a cackle, but, he grabs my hand and he leads me over to a little nook where there are a few children gathered. They couldn't have been older than 6 or 7, and they were oohing and eyeing over something. I peer over their heads and I see that one of the kids has a butterfly perched on his finger. I have no clue what kind of butterfly it was, but it had wide black wings with yellowish stripes on them, and it looked to my deranged eyes to be more like a condor than a butterfly. Well, my crazy starts to kick in a little bit, and I'm trying to back away slowly. My head's lowered, and I'm hoping that nobody has noticed me. But of course, nothing is ever that easy. One of the kids' mothers looks up and says, "Oh, Billy, you've spent enough time with that butterfly. Why don't you let that nice lady hold it?" I look around because I'm wondering who this nice lady is that she's referring to, and I feel my guy jab me in the back. She means you, which makes me laugh until I realize that he's not kidding. So now I have a mother, my guy, and a group of school kids staring at me and wondering why this so-called nice lady hasn't yet reached out to take that darling little terror. Shame is rarely an effective tool to make me do something that I don't want to do, because most of the time, I just don't care what people think of me. But there was something about the earnest look on the kids' faces that it just got to me. And I'm thinking, what's the big deal? I mean, this butterfly seems pretty chill, right? What's it going to do? So I hesitantly reach out, and I hold my finger out, and I let that thing hop on. Well, it was weird. It was a really weird sensation. It's got these prickly little feet-like things, and they're gripping my finger. But for a moment, I'm completely exhilarated. I'm thinking, I've done it. I've got a crazy insect on my hand, and neither of us has attacked or died. Even my guy seems blown away, and he's reaching into his pocket, right, to grab his phone and commemorate the big event with a picture. When, of course, all hell breaks loose. I suppose I should have known better than to make eye contact with the beast. I held it up and I stared into the deep blackness of its beady little eyes, and clearly neither of us liked what we saw. It kicks its wings into full gear, flapping around erratically and launching itself directly toward me. Fully extended, those goddamn wings had to have been the same width as my face. And lacking any real direction or momentum, that thing smacked right into my nose. I could have handled the whole thing gracefully. I could have laughed and gently guided that butterfly back to safer ground. Like a normal person. Yeah, I did none of that. Instead, I start swatting the air as though I was beset by a plague of locusts and not some single fragile butterfly. And I am frantically waving my arms around in panic and not caring what they connect with. I take off running, and I knock through those kids like the Kool-Aid Man. And I don't stop until I have escaped that house of winged horrors. My guy finds me panting and rocking back and forth on a bench. I was a mess. Well, he quickly collects me, and we hustle ourselves out the nearest exit before security can show us the way. So much for my experiment in bravery. We went home that night and watched 5 solid hours of perfectly grisly horror movies without my even blinking an eye. I don't know what exactly that says about me, but I will tell you this much. I will willingly go nose to nose with the biggest, baddest ghost, clown, or deranged killer on the block. But should something with extra legs come shuffling out of the drain, well, that will be the last you'll see of me. And now I gotta shake off these horrors with a little bit of bourbon. Oh, that's so easy to drink. I love it. All this talk about fears has kind of got me thinking about turnoffs. Now, it's not the same thing, I know, but turnoffs can be potentially just as squirm-inducing. There is a world of random squicky things that can generally repulse a person, and there is no better way to experience bad habits and gross behavior than dating. Dating gives you the opportunity to wade through personal cesspools, all with the hopes of finding the right one that can mix with your own. Throughout my dating years, I really did try hard to not be too judgy. I mean, we're all gross in our own ways. But sometimes, there are things you just cannot overlook. Like this one time, I completely dismissed a guy because I thought his head was literally too big for his body. Which it absolutely was. It seemed to hover over his stubby little neck like a hot air balloon. And just the thought of potentially seeing that thing looming over me during sex, just gave me the yips. And I'll tell you, I felt like a colossal ass heap for dodging his calls after that first date. I mean, really, the date wasn't all that bad. But what the hell was I going to say to the guy? Your head weirds me out? No, that's never okay. But the universe works in mysterious ways because not long after that, I got my comeuppance in a guy that I'll call Catnip. He was a fairly well-known musician that I met through a mutual friend. Who am I kidding? Really, that's just a less damning way of saying that I knew his band and I was more interested in the guitar player, but that guy had a girlfriend, so I moved on to Catnip, the singer. To be fair to Catnip, he really wasn't a bad person. He was usually thoughtful and surprisingly romantic, and really just a fun guy to be around. Unfortunately, he was also gross. He wasn't immediately gross. It's not like he dressed like a hobo or emitted any sort of unwashed smell. No. His grossness seeped out of him over time like an oily leak. My first indication that Catnip may not have been all that cleanly came when I moved into a new apartment. This was a really big deal for me because up until that point, I had been crashing with a girlfriend, waiting to get my finances in order. It was a ground floor apartment set off a very shitty golf course, which meant for several months out of the year, I was treated to a parade of golf carts driving by my concrete slab of a patio. And maintenance wasn't especially great in the building either, which I quickly learned when it took 6 weeks to get my bedroom window repaired after a golf ball crashed through it. No one ever said the life of a writer is glamorous. But the place was all mine, and I was really excited to have Catnip over just as soon as I got settled. He arrived with 2 bags of what he called housewarming presents. And initially, I'm overwhelmed with gratitude. I'm thinking, I'm such a lucky girl. He's such a thoughtful guy, blah, blah, blah. Because then, I caught sight of what he brought. Y'all, here is exactly what he unpacked. 1 package of rock-hard bagels. 1 half-empty carton of orange juice. 3 Hungry Man Salisbury steak entrees that expired in the 80s. And this was my favorite. 1 brown paper bag containing a caramel apple with a bite taken out. There were also 5 unwrapped Lemonhead candies, a handful of takeout mayonnaise and ketchup packs, 1 spice jar labeled oregano that turned out to be catnip, and an assortment of VHS cassettes and DVDs, half of which I would later discover were broken. He lays everything out on my kitchen table like tributes to a queen. And he looked so damn pleased with himself that I immediately felt like an awful human being for being kind of repulsed by these manhandled gifts. But I didn't want to come off as a bitch or ungrateful, especially when all of that stuff had probably been pulled from his own home. That is, unless he'd pilfered it from a dumpster somewhere. But either way, he clearly didn't see anything wrong with any of it. And who was I to judge? I thanked him profusely for being so thoughtful, and then quickly disposed of it all after he left. Not surprisingly, Catnip's home had a very similar used quality to it. He lived in an apartment so far south of Chicago it may as well have been Indiana. Now, on the surface, it looked like any musician habitat. It was decorated with gear and his one and only gold record, all of which was centered around a large velvet couch with several suspicious white stains on it. Now, Catnip never paid them any attention, but I always made it a point to be fully clothed while sitting on that couch. The last thing I wanted was to contract some sort of couch STD. He also had 3 cats, which didn't initially concern me until I found out that they all shared a litter box that he kept in his bedroom. They would dig away in that thing and then hop right into his bed, which no matter how many times I changed the sheets, always had something of a crunchy feel. None of these issues seemed insurmountable. I figured Catnip had just spent too much time on a tour bus. So my hope was that in time I could sneak some Clorox into Catnip's life and scrub things up without him ever really noticing. But then, about 4 weeks into our relationship, Catnip decided to dye his hair. Like most musicians who haven't sold their souls to the devil, Catnip was aging. His dark hair was turning visibly gray, and one afternoon he decided to do something about it. He bought himself a bottle of cheap hair dye and showed up at my place that night looking as though he had coated his head in shoe polish. But that's not the worst of it. Oh no, there's more. My low-rent Nikki Six spent that night obsessively scratching at his scalp. It would seem that the chemicals in his cheap hair dye had irritated his skin, and the more he dug his fingers into his itchy head, the more hair dye residue he ground under his fingernails. After a few hours, his nails began to look as though he had just clawed his way out of a grave. And every time he would reach for me, I'd try really, really hard to not recoil. It was just icky. And I could smell the ammonia in his skin. We spent 2 whole movies in an awkward dance of aversion. And he ultimately went home that night dejected and a little pissed off because I just could not have sex with him. Y'all, I admit it. I was an asshole for not saying something. I know this. Because by not wanting to hurt Catnip's feelings, I made him feel even worse. So he shows up on my doorstep 3 days later, uttering the dreaded phrase, "We need to talk." I invited him in, thinking that maybe now I would finally grow a pair and come clean about the ickiness and maybe salvage our relationship. But as we sat on my couch, I found I couldn't pay attention to a word he said. Instead, I could only stare at his fingers. The tips were now completely stained black, and his nails were crusted over with black grime. So millions of thoughts are running through my head. Hasn't this guy showered? Does he not see his fingers? And is he eating food that way? I was so wrapped up in Catnip's stained appearance, I completely missed the fact that he had just broken up with me. So there's silence, and I see him staring at me, waiting for some sort of reaction. So I ask him to repeat himself. "I don't think we should see each other anymore," he says. Now I'm dumbfounded. What? He's breaking up with me? Catnip nods. And then he launches into a sorry sort of "it's not you, it's me, but it's really you" explanation. He's twisting those grimy shoe polish hands together in embarrassment. And that kind of makes me think that there's more to this breakup than he's letting on. So I press him for details. Catnip hesitates. And he's asking, can't we just let it go? And then he says, "I don't want to insult you." This sounds juicy. What in the world could a guy who regularly sleeps in cat litter possibly have to say to me that would be insulting? He sighs, then sheepishly explains. It turns out, Catnip couldn't stand the sound of me blowing my nose. "It's just so loud," he says, like trombone loud. And my jaw drops. I don't even know how to respond to that. So Catnip continues. He says, "Well, you probably can't help it, but I really think you should be aware of it because it's just not attractive on a girl." He then stands up, kisses my forehead, and lets himself out. I sat still for several minutes, trying to determine if I should appreciate or resent his honesty. In the end, it didn't matter. When I was really honest with myself, I was relieved to be rid of him and his dirty fingers, even if it did come at the cost of my own ego. Amusingly, I heard through the musical grapevine that Catnip recently got married. I can only presume that he's cleaned up his act in the years that have passed. I have a hard time imagining the kind of woman who would marry Catnip, but for her sake, I hope she doesn't have any allergies. Well, y'all, I think that's enough out of me. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Unwritable Rant Podcast. To keep up with the show and all the crazy adventures that I'm having, as well as get the inside info on some of my new favorite bourbons, head on over to theunwritablерant.com and sign up for my emails. There's also some very cool swag available, and you will find links to all of the ways that you can connect with me on social media. I will say this, Twitter is your best bet. But now I'm going to head on out and have myself some new adventures. Hope you have a great week. I'll be back again next Sunday to share some more bourbon-soaked stories. Cheers, y'all.
Go to theunwritablerant.com and sign up to get early access to interviews and new videos. You can hear new episodes of The Unwritable Rant on radiovegas.rocks every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Eastern and on IPMNation.com on Saturdays and Sundays at 6 p.m. Eastern, and hear best of episodes every weekday at 3 p.m. Eastern. And don't forget to connect with Juliette on Twitter at Morning Neurosis.
Girl, you was pretty as a Sunday morning, standing on the corner at Carondelet. What you say we make our way up to Bourbon, couple hurricanes and a hand grenade, and get blown away. Let the chips fall where they may. If it's all the same, what you say, bon ton, hey, pretty mama, I can smell the gumbo. Sweetest taste of honeysuckle on my lips. Good God Almighty, I can hear the trombone. Every heart ought to beat to a rhythm like this. Come a little closer, honey, let me hold you. Nothing tastes better than a bourbon kiss. You can be the flower on my magnolia. Every heart ought to beat to a rhythm like this.